Okay, we're now recording. So, our first chapter, Seeking an Understanding of School Culture Using Theory as a Framework for Observation. Um, why don't we first do a overview or summary of the article? Is anybody brave enough to give a little summary, a review of the chapter? Who wants to take that on for our audience?
So I'll jump in and then please, everybody help me out here. I thought this was kind of interesting because it seemed to me that there was actually a practitioner based in the high school. And so she was able to then sort of look at how change happened in the high school and use her own experience with that. But then because she had access to so many people through that, she was able to then interview them and get kind of first-hand accounts and then do kind of an ethnographic look at what the status of change was. And it seemed to me like she was trying to be an impartial observer, but that she also recognized that there was no way she could take herself out of it. And she tried to use that as a source of strength in terms of understanding how the high school, Emerson High School, went through this change procedure.
And excuse me, I thought it was really interesting how she kind of broke it apart. I know, first of all, like being part of the research herself, and how she was able to kind of navigate that space while continuing to try to be, not part of it, but be part of it. But just the way she kind of broke down in the article, the different groups that she was working with. I think she had 3 different teams. She had an at-risk committee, a school improvement team, and a department head team, as well as administrators. So looking at a school reform initiative and kind of looking at how different people looked at that. I know that she said in her research that one of the teams was primarily made up of teachers who were either consistent and in line with the thinking of the administration or the administrator, as well as new teachers, right? And then she had another group that were elected by their peers who tended to be more veteran teachers and the way they look at things. And then another group being department heads. And so those department heads, and that being part of their job, was to kind of get buy-in to what they were doing. And so kind of the conflicting perspectives as they look through it. And then the administrator being, a different component to, part of all of those groups, but yet, outside of it. I thought was kind of fascinating when you're looking at you're looking at culture or school culture and how to kind of penetrate that culture and kind of understanding maybe some of those unspoken rules, or how how they work with one another, and how I think somewhere in the article it said too that although on paper it looked like their school reform initiative was very successful, that there were so many other components that really weren't, but you had to kind of be inside to see what a challenge those things were. So
yeah, Marcy, you just brought up something. So like I think every department is very data driven, right? Like, especially right now with everything that we're going through and having to fight to show that our programs and our departments are should sustain and should continue to be here to offer services for our students. But as I think specifically with sorority and fraternity, like, we have to put out end of year reports every year to show that our groups are improving, that we're retaining our students, that they are improving in charitable giving and service contributions. And like, that is supposed to show that a cultural change is happening, or that the impact is improving. And on paper, sure, like that may look great and that might like increase donor dollars, but it's so funny, like being inside of it, like you know that the cultural change is not occurring unless more of like the qualitative side of it, like talking with them about their experience and like what they feel is happening within their organization, and that doesn't always translate to the paper. So I really kind of related to that. Yeah, and I think that also ties in, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit when we say like, what did we learn from this? Because I've been really thinking about my like dissertation ideas, and a lot of the stuff I want to do is something I'm so like deeply entrenched in. And I'm like, how would I be able to remove my biases? Like, I don't know. So I really found this article interesting from that perspective, or this chapter. I keep saying article, but
I actually think both, and we'll get to the other reading later, but I think both works thematically kind of talked about that in a roundabout way, that question of like, can the researcher ever really remove their bias? Should they? And, you know, if we assume that they can't, then how do they use that bias and then also check it to make sure that they're doing really quality work. I do have to say, I think it was hilarious that the principal, if I caught this, I think she said something to the effect of the principal torpedoed all efforts at reform, which I thought really spoke to that, what we see today too, that idea that there's like such a huge difference between administration and faculty on the ground.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. I actually work with graduate students, we call them graduate teaching fellows, who their GA-ship is teaching in a school for their 20 hours a week as opposed to working on campus. And so we have about 33 of them, and we always have a small percentage of them that go into school administration, which as a brand new teacher, like you can't be an administrator unless you have a certain number of years of experience being a teacher. But I'm always curious what kind of perspective that gives them, because the administrative perspective is so different. And what I have found, whether it's in higher ed or P12, is there's some things that not everyone knows. And so sometimes there are decisions that administrators make that are hard decisions, and they're not always forthcoming with everyone on why they're making them. And there sometimes are big, huge reasons they're making them, and really they might be, if everyone knew, if people thinking they're in the best interests of the entire organization or culture or school, but sometimes they can't, for whatever reason, be forthcoming about why those decisions are being made. And so I always think that's an interesting perspective for a new teacher to have going in, kind of seeing behind that, what is it, was there a seeing behind the curtain a little bit, and kind of getting that perspective. Because I know when they talked about, I thought that the bias thing was so fast. And as soon as I started reading it and realized that the researcher made themselves part of the school, I mean, my own experience in schools, I was like, I don't see how you could be not, that wouldn't bias your some way or another. I mean, there's so many subcultures, there's so many things going on in schools that, but then how could you really get it? But if you're an outsider, would you really be able to get in to really learn from what's happening? You probably wouldn't. So I thought that was interesting. But I know in the article they talked a lot about teachers being upset with discipline. Because feeling that they, made a decision, sent the student or whatever, to the administrators to take care of it, and then the administrators felt that they were kind of, not supporting them. And then if you as a teacher don't feel supported, then it's hard. So it's hard to kind of, and then I think the researcher said too, I think she said that she found herself feeling the same way, getting angry and upset. So yeah, no, I thought that was, fascinating to think about how, if I were in that situation, when I think about my own dissertation topics too, I kind of teeter on, am I going to do something around teacher preparation because that's what I do, right? Or not, but thinking how difficult that would be, and how you kind of have to make yourself, people need to respect you enough to let you in, right? And what does that look like? Because from my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you all got this, it looked like this person decided to go into the school and get a job there for the purpose of this research. Because I think it said that this person was also a principal, a superintendent, had all these different experiences, but then was going back as a teacher. So how weird is that to be like, I'm here, I'm teaching with you, but I'm also observing you, and I'm researching you, and I'm trying to figure it out. And I think the researcher talked about that in the article too, talked about how that was kind of a weird balance between feeling an alliance to teachers and things and administrators and really liking the administrator, but also needed to be able to pursue the work in a lens that was, as unbiased as possible. So I thought that was fascinating.
I thought it was interesting too how she suggested that theory guided everything that she did, and that having the theory kept her from being too biased, that was like the root of everything. And she used that word I'm going to say this wrong, propriospect.
I looked that word up. I didn't know. I wasn't sure what that meant.
I like that. I took it to mean basically that each individual has their own multitude of ways of looking at things, right? That each individual is unique and has their own unique perspective. Does that seem on par with kind of how you were interpreting?
Yeah, absolutely. Just their own personal outlook on, yeah.
I thought that was the interesting part. They talked about using the theory to remove themselves and be objective, but at the same time, they would come back and talk about how it was so difficult to remove themselves and the different situations that they had, the emotional reactions that they related to the teachers, even though they had the same negative reactions as some of the teachers. So they kind of relied on the theory to remove themselves for it, but I didn't ever get the sense that they truly were able to remove themselves from the evaluation of what was going on. So I think the value of the theoretical framework is that it allows you to distance yourself a little bit, but in this situation, like, you're embedded in it. So can you actually truly disconnect yourself or take an objective perspective, which I don't think is actually there.
Yeah.
We're at 11:30.
Wow, time flies.
I was just overall with this article really impressed about just the research that she did in identifying theories and methodologies that supported what she was trying to do. And she talks about her use of theory, about how she specifically sought out research that supported the fact that she wanted to be embedded in the school and what that meant for researchers. And then the theories that she used to guide how she collected data and then how she analyzed her data. So there were two, the good enough theory and then the other guy, Gertz. So I think she talks about the fact that the guiding questions for her research were derived directly from those theories, but it seemed like she was kind of able to take bits and pieces of the different theoretical frameworks that she was looking into to kind of make it work for her, essentially. Like she talks about on page 22, she started the case study without a thesis. So it was kind of like she knew generally what she wanted to do, but it seems like the theories really helped her in formulating something that had some kind of structure to it.
Yeah.
Did you pick this up too, or maybe I read into this that she was actually encouraged to just find something that was simpler to do, but yet she was very persistent in that she wanted the dissertation to really inform, you know, her work and maybe future work, and so she was willing to take the extra time and embed herself, like I said, for the entire year, where others might have said, you know, you just do it and get it done and then like think beyond that. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah.
A lot, so.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I noticed of the model she chose was she was looking through different frameworks and they all hit a piece of it. But then when she came upon, I think it was Goodenow, was that framework allowed her to look at the whole group and then smaller groups and then the individual level that other frameworks. And so as she was working through the frameworks, she learned different things from them, but they weren't able to be applied to what she wanted to do specifically with the research she was doing. I felt like that was a big piece of her working through the different frameworks that she looked at.
Yeah. I also think a weird takeaway that I think comes a little bit from that prospect, I have no idea if I'm saying this right, so please don't mock me if it's wrong, was that essentially people believe their assumptions more than they believe facts. Mm-hmm. And they cling to that, even if presented with evidence to the contrary. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was interesting to kind of understand and empathize a little bit with the subcultures, because I know I've been in change movements before where people are slow to adapt to things. And I've been like, but if you just look at these facts, you know, these are facts. And people are like, no, we don't care. So it was really interesting for me to see someone like spell it out like that they just, you know, their subculture belief system was far more important than any factual evidence that the principal or the
what's around us.
I know.
I felt that across both articles was identity, and I mean the change that we're going through right now is like, of course, like merging and identities, and that was exactly what we're living right now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Mark, you just set us up for a beautiful transition.
You're welcome.
I want to thank you. You did a great job. So that we can transition to chapter 6, which was using multiple theoretical frameworks to study organizational change. And I will happily just kick us off with a quick summary of what this chapter kind of detailed. And so it really looked at a reorganization of a department. And so it was I believe, a year-long study of faculty from different departments. And they were asked to journal their experiences. And the study wanted to see how faculty would respond to a reorganization, how they make sense of the experience, and how they construct new forms of identity. And so the researcher used 2 theoretical frameworks to help better understand organizational change. And so it really looks at the theories of, and again, I might say this one wrong, so liminality, and then this organizational identity or identification. And so the chapter really spends time looking at those 2 theories. And so just so that we have some context, I also looked up what liminality means before the chapter got into it. But liminality is really this idea of a transitional period and a status during a rite or passage. And it talked about, it's like if an individual, like when an individual gives up one social phase but isn't quite ready for the next. So if you think like when you're done dating but you're not quite married. So I just like to think of analogies. It helps me think about things in a different way. So so that's to kind of set us up to talk through what this chapter really looked like. And yes, this is very timely and very relevant, obviously.
Yeah.
One thing that really stuck out to me about this chapter was toward the end, where the authors used this line, and I had to write it down for the whole quote. The purpose of the theoretical framework, however, is not to provide comfortable clothing for data. And I loved that analogy of comfortable clothing for data, but also I think I had been kind of looking at frameworks as like, in the first article, she found a framework that very neatly kind of explained what she was experiencing. Whereas for these authors, they found, 2 frameworks, and neither framework perfectly like described everything that they were experiencing. And so they had some time and, took some space just to acknowledge that you can have a framework, but still not have like it perfectly describe all of your data.
I think what I appreciated about it was it described it as both like a problem and a solution. The framework's both a problem and a solution, and that in some ways it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think is what the term they used in it. And so how do you analyze it to, I guess, fit the framework, but also critique it in a way that is new and fresh, and isn't necessarily just saying, yep, I support whatever this framework is, but look at it in an objective way that creates the data that is true to this research study that you've done. So that's what I've appreciated about that part of it was it acknowledged that sometimes you can get into a lens of you're just trying to fit your research into a framework to make it valid, to make it legitimate. But that can also be a problem in the research that you do.
Yeah. I what's interesting is I found myself thinking about the other article and the person being the self-researcher as I was reading this, given the current, currently what's going on. I know in my own position, because of reorganization, my job has changed significantly. And we've kind of brought two different offices together now. And so thinking to myself, maybe I should be taking notes. Maybe this is something, because it's such a unique experience. And also trying to do and lead this work, from my home, right? So, it's a different kind of it's just the many challenges that the current time is, bringing. But, looking at, the different, kind of political kinds of factors that go into play, and the kind of, I know when you're talking about like the organization identity, kind of social, political, economic aspects of the restructure, I know you're talking about that's what kept kind of going through my mind as I was reading this article, just like, how is this impacting our own institution, and how can this kind of work kind of inform, our thinking, and so that's kind of what I was thinking a lot of when I was reading it. It's just kept going back to our own context, right? My mind just kept shifting back to our own.
The one thing I was thinking about, so with this idea of the liminality, like when you remove that one like rite of passage, or that you give up that one social phase, it says that you're essentially like all on the same playing field, right? Like it removes that level of hierarchy. And so I was like, and obviously, like Dave always said, we're in our safe circle when we're talking about things, but I know that a lot of people that had their positions abolished, or that lost their roles, new positions are being created, and some people, our colleagues, are having to like fight it out for like these different roles, or it, like all of these things that are being created. And I'm like, I wonder if we took a framework of this liminality, and all of these individuals that lost these positions, like if a new department or if something was created and there was no hierarchy that was created, and they're put together here, and that's how this department is formed, to see like what culture would be created, what success would come out of this, like what would happen, rather than like we're literally doing exactly what happened prior to us getting into this budget situation, prior to having to remove jobs. Like you're just starting off at lower pay grades. Like I don't know I necessarily understand that's the way to go with some of these positions that were let go, and then to just rehire at lower price, like or lower pay. So I just think that it may have been worth looking at. I'm really fascinated by this idea of like removing the hierarchy altogether and then being on a level playing field. But
yeah. Well, it also makes me think of, in places where maybe they aren't hiring, like, is it realistic to expect people to be successful when you've doubled, just kind of mushed everything together and thought, here's something where you had these valued colleagues that, embrace this work, and then you're saying, well, we're just going to like, you just kind of shuffle things around. And does that really set things up for success too? In the restructuring of, and because now we're having, new departments or new offices or new people that are sharing responsibilities and things. And so like what's setting them up to be successful when you do this? We actually, in my college many years ago, when we became The Patton College, which is a very comprehensive college of education, because we have recreation, sport pedagogy, we have retail merchandising, we have restaurant, hotel tourism, and then our biggest programs are in teacher education, but we also have higher education and counseling. So it's a really kind of, I've heard it described as a comprehensive college of education, because it's not traditionally what you think of in education, but was when the Health and Human Services went through a reorganization. And so programs were looking for homes, right? And so it took the amount of time it took too for everyone. It wasn't just a department, but thinking about it in a college. Like I think it was either Akron or Toledo that they said they eliminated a bunch of their colleges, but really in my reading, it was more they just took a bunch of different programs and reassembled them differently. And so not only thinking about that departmentally, like the article did, but thinking about when entire colleges, entire programs, you're just kind of reorganizing. And then how do you lead those types of charges when suddenly you might have been, this great leader when it came to, these programs, and then suddenly you have all these other, things that you might know little about too. There's just so much that goes into it. But
there was so much in this article that was like ringing true to current situations. That's
why I keep trying to look at you. I'm like looking down, but I know that you might not be
bringing staff together and all that type of thing. And thinking of the subcultures that you bring together actually persist beyond anything new that you bring together. So how do you break that down? And even at some point, I think they talked about, depending on the framework you take, the outcome and the conclusion is different. So you can take the same study and put a different framework to it, and you're going to come probably to a different conclusion. So what does that mean for your research, and how does that play out in the grand scheme of things? But this entire article and chapter was just ringing through of, how do you bring people together and at the right times and the right conversations and the right levels, try to integrate and have those sense making, I think is what they talked about in there. It was completely true, but at the same time, depending on the lens that people are coming from, is there a way of getting them on the same wavelength when you come from maybe different frameworks or different thought processes coming into the situation?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting for these authors because two authors wrote this chapter, but it sounded like there had been originally 5 and then one dropped off, but that each of them had come from different disciplines originally. And so they all had kind of their own theoretical lenses that they had more background in. So I thought that was interesting for how they were able to kind of like cross-check one another and also have multiple lenses through which to see things. But I also liked that they were really open that they had written those 2 different articles that essentially did come to, maybe not different conclusions, but like looked at it through a different facet in both of those. And then they had this article, and I was kind of wondering like, well, what's the so what? Like, you've done these 2 articles and now this chapter that's kind of summarizing what you did. What is your overall takeaway from this, other than merging is difficult, right? Like what is the overall point? And I will say, I don't know if anyone else felt like this, but sometimes when I read articles like this, I'm like, okay, yes, we know you're very theoretical and you want to talk about it, and okay, it reminded me a little bit of some stuff that I used to read when I was an English major, where I was like, yes, we know the postmodern theory, but why do we care? Like, so there was a little tiny sliver of that, if I'm being honest, as I read through this one.
But I think the fact that we can see we're all practitioners and we all do very different things in our day-to-day jobs, and I think we can see reading the frameworks and thinking about how we might apply them to our current circumstances, whatever they are. I liked on 115 the way that the authors talk about theoretical frameworks provide the pathway to overcome the local contextualized nature of data collection and to allow a form of generalization that some say qualitative research lacks. And I think that's helpful to think about it because, Lauren, to your point, like we can have articles with a lot of flowery language talking about all the different theories, but maybe one of the beliefs or misconceptions I have specifically about qualitative research like this is that it's not generalizable or applicable to anything broader than like the specific department or the specific case study or whatever it is. I think it's helpful to understand, getting a better understanding of how researchers are using the theoretical frameworks to kind of achieve that to some level with qualitative research.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah.
How are we on time, Sarah?
We are at 30 minutes right now.
Any final thoughts from anyone?
Was this chapter the one that also said something at one point about they had original theories or frameworks that they thought about that proved in the long run proved not to be actually worthwhile, or they didn't actually frame out their findings? I don't know, maybe one of these chapters, I thought there was something that they were hopeful that one framework was actually going to get applied to their research. And then as they went through it and learned about it, that it actually was not as applicable. So
It was definitely one of the chapters.
yeah,
I
I just felt like that was an
one of them.
important piece to highlight as we're looking at the frameworks and I guess learning about how the heck we do this and apply it, that we're probably going to latch on to different frameworks or think that we have the right answer.
Yeah.
And then as we go through it and learn more about whatever we're digging into, that may or may not actually be the case. So that was the only other thing that I was going to point out that I thought was valuable in these chapters.
Yeah.
Well, I will also say that, like, I think I'm leaning towards like probably a qualitative approach. I mean, I don't know, because based on classes that could change. And so I think I had in my head that the only way that I would approach that would be by interviewing and questions. So I kind of like that this was approached through journaling, and some of the ideas that I'm tossing around, especially because it's in the field that I'm in, that could be very sticky. And so I'm like, ooh, journals, that is a really good idea. So I got a lot out of this article, but if anything, I really got out of like, oh, that's a really good application to this. So
Yeah. And just the idea that you can start out, I think this was the article that she had done, that one of the authors had like coded all of her data and everything, and then went back and did more reading and found a different author and a citation from whatever. But it's nice to feel that there's like flexibility and that you can get that far down the path of something and be like, oh no, but actually this works better.
Yeah. I think these
I found
is theoretical candor, which I thought was pretty great. Like, kind of being really honest with the theory that you're using, and because they read each other's work, they were able to be really candid about what was working and what wasn't.
I found myself thinking a lot about like the chicken and the egg, like in terms of theoretical frameworks, like how that would be helpful to have something identified and then be able to, move within that, or to be able to have your things and find something. I know, I think Pete said that this was one of the first times they've taught this, or they just started teaching theoretical frameworks as a class. Maybe I heard that wrong. But I know in my husband's own dissertation journey, he, like, I'm telling him about this class and I'm like, we look at all these frameworks and then we can think, and he keeps saying, oh my gosh, that would have like totally changed my entire experience had I like even really understood what a theoretical framework is. And so although I find some of this to be so challenging, I'm also like just kind of excited to know that there's so many different ways you can look at things, and you can kind of be thinking about how to do that, because I think for some that don't have these intentional conversations like this throughout, I think that it could be more challenging. So I agree, having the flexibility, but yet kind of knowing, using it as a guide or not, or finding something that fits. I appreciate that. So.
Okay, we're at 34 minutes.
Perfect. I think we've given them all we need to. So thanks, and we hope that this helps aid in your reading and understanding chapters 2 and 6.